Okay, so the topic I'm going to talk about today is regional organizations and democracy promotion. I chose a bit of a broader title because I'm also going to give you a bit of a broader overview at the beginning of what I mean by that, or what especially regional organizations are and what they do in terms of democracy promotion. But then I'm going to focus specifically on the limitations they have faced, and thus the first part of the title, Toothless Tigers. So the question is why, basically why regional organizations, despite their equipment with norms and instruments to defend and protect and promote democracy, they have often had only very limited success or been very not so effective or efficient in that respect. So actually, it's a topic or research program that I've been dealing with for more than 10 years now, and its origin stayed back even further, one could say, in the period where I did my PhD, and my PhD was on external and internal influences on democracy, comparing like the increasing influence of external factors on democratization processes. And then at the same time, during this period, I was also working in a research project as a research associate on regional organizations and conflict mitigation, in particular world regions, and my specific area was Latin America. And so this project is a little bit of a synergy, or this topic is a little bit of a synergy of these initial early research projects, because on the one hand, it is located in the field of comparative politics, the question of which factors foster democracy and what can be done to counter democratic erosion or democratic crisis, if you want. And then on the other hand, it focuses on regional international organizations and their role in conflict and crisis mitigation, mainly in their member states. And so this is a project, or well, you can't really call it a project, it's more like a research program that I've been following on, or that I've been working on now for quite some time. I published a book together with a senior colleague who was also interested in this topic already like 8 years or so now, which focused on the Organization of American States and its role in the promotion and protection specifically of democracy in crisis in the still young democracies in Latin America. And from this followed a number of other papers, projects, presentations. For example, while I was visiting professor in Brazil, I did a lot of my kind of formal hat I had on was a chair for German and European studies. And thus, despite being an expert more on Latin America, I gave a lot of presentations on this topic of the crisis of democracy, comparing Europe and Latin America, which obviously with the rise of populism and authoritarianism was quite and still is, continues to be a quite timely topic. But then also looking at the role of regional organizations, and then also comparing the Latin American organizations with the European ones, mainly the European Union, and what it can do and has done, and also its limitations it has been facing in the defense of the rule of law and democracy in countries such as Poland and Hungary. And currently I'm involved in a book project, one could say, that is kind of sponsored by Scripts, Contestations of the Liberal Script. That's a big research center based in Germany, but with a number of partners around the world, including in Latin America. And I've been attending 2 regional conferences last year and this year, where I also presented on this topic of the protection of democracy in Latin America specifically, and the problems this practice has been facing. And on this basis, I'm now working on a book chapter and also hopefully an article with 1 or 2 colleagues that were also involved in this project. This conference series. So this is a little bit to give you an idea. And besides that, I'm also kind of part of a network on external democracy promotion. It's mainly Germany-based, but also with people in other European countries that are largely interested in how democracy can be promoted and defended by external actors, mainly. So that could be governments, but also international and regional organizations. And in this context, I'm also currently co-editing a special issue where we look at this practice of democracy promotion in times of autocratization. So kind of the challenges the democracy promoters like the Western countries, the European Union and others are facing now that democratization is no longer kind of the predominant trend, but rather many countries see trends of autocratization, and including the countries that have been kind of prominent democracy promoters in the past. Think of the United States, for example. So with that kind of big context, if you want, I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual topic of my talk. If I could move my slides, I don't know, it doesn't seem to work. Yes, now it's moving. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief introduction about what regional organizations have done regarding democracy or regarding soft norms, if you want, more generally. Then focusing in this presentation, I've decided to focus on Europe and Latin America and give a brief comparison of what regional organizations have done in these two regions, and then talk about more specifically the limitations regional organizations have been facing, and kind of thinking about why these limitations are in place. So basically, this question of what regional organizations can do to promote democracy or protect democracy has become relevant over the past few decades. And you can see here this graph from a different research project that I was not involved in personally, but it kind of mapped what can be called norm prescription by regional organizations across different world regions. Of course, it doesn't include all regional organizations in the world. It's also a limited sample of, I think, about 15, 16 organizations that were included here. And then they checked whether these organizations have any normative provisions to promote, protect norms like democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and also anti-corruption norms in their member states. And you can see that there has been a big leap, especially, well, starting in the 1980s, 1990s, especially in the 1990s, you can see that many of these norms have been adopted by a number of regional organizations. So it has become an increasingly important topic. And it looks like regional organizations have the idea to promote norms in their member states. And this has become, and this has gone hand in hand actually with the practice of democracy promotion as implemented by several major states. It's kind of incentivized, if you want, by the end of the Cold War, where there was a lot of optimism that democracy would now spread across the world, and states were exploring what could be done to further foster democratization processes, not necessarily by imposing democracy, but rather by supporting democratization processes, a democratic opposition that was protesting against an authoritarian regime, or at the stage of where first elections had already taken place. And then the question was how to consolidate democracy and kind of strengthen democratic norms and constitutions and so on. And so in this big context, regional organizations also became active in this area. Basically, I've been using, as you might have noticed, promotion and protection of democracy. And I've myself reflected a little bit on these various terms in the context of this book project about a decade ago, and I kind of refined it a little bit in recent years. And so one could say that promotion, well, it's a bit difficult in the discussion because promotion of democracy is also kind of a big umbrella term, if you want, to denote this whole field of discussion or this whole practice of externally influencing democratization processes. But more specifically, one could say promotion of democracy means supporting ongoing democratic transition processes. So if you want movements towards more democracy, whereas protection would be protecting the level of democracy or the type of democratic practice that have already been achieved. So things like, for instance, election monitoring, to kind of monitor, to check, to protect the democratic norms and practices and processes that are already in place. Whereas finally, defense relates to defending democracy against any attacks, like against a coup attempt, for instance, or any other attempts by elected office holders even to subvert the democratic proceedings, to change the constitution, to alter the balance of powers in their favor, and things like that. And more specifically, there are a number of mechanisms and instruments that regional organizations in particular, but also one could, especially in the area of democracy promotion, states have been using to promote democracy. In regional organizations, some have started, and most have actually started with a formal adherence to democratic norm, kind of having in their primary legal documents an endorsement of democracy as a norm, or even putting democracy as a membership requirement. And some have gone further and created institutionalized mechanisms to promote, protect, and/or defend democracy. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them here. Like in the area of democracy promotion, there's things like capacity building, supporting electoral processes, like the very simple on-the-ground logistics of setting up an election, having polling stations in place, or even after a longer period of civil war or autocratic rule, kind of rebuilding institutions, even as things as simple as re-erecting a building for a constitutional court or for the parliament or things like that. It could also be things like workshops for newly elected members of parliament or for political parties. Other things include negative and positive incentives, and this is something where regional organizations, in particular the European Union, has had quite a prominent role in democratization processes, both in Southern Europe and also in the former post-communist countries in Eastern Europe, like by creating or by setting this goal of EU membership as an incentive that also comes with financial benefits and so on. They put in, the European Union put in place a number of aims and conditions that states need to comply with before they can even start membership negotiations. That we all might have recently heard about this discussion related to Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia and other countries in the Western Balkans as well. And then just jumping to protection, mindful of time, jumping to protection and defense. So protection, as I've already said, one very common practice that many regional organizations, but also some states do is, also non-governmental organizations in some cases, is election observation or election monitoring. Some also call it election verification, so kind of observing the electoral process and then naming and shaming the country if any major electoral fraud, instances of electoral fraud are visible, or whatever malpractice. Another possibility is political analysis that would involve a continuous monitoring of the state of democracy in a country. Some organizations do that, but mostly at this point on a kind of informal basis. So the results are not published. It's more for kind of internal consumption, or they just do it in the case of countries that seem to be in crisis or going towards some sort of crisis. And finally, defense, it's kind of reactive mechanisms, mainly reactions to norm violations that have already occurred, and that could be diplomatic mechanisms like some sort of negotiation, mediation process between the government and the opposition, for instance, or could even be sanctions like the suspension of the membership of the country from a regional organization. Moving on, just a quick overview, and again, just a selection of regional organizations mapping which types of norms and instruments they have. You can see here a number of examples from Latin America and Europe, but also from Africa and Asia. And many of, and all of these organizations listed here have at some point formally adhered to democratic norms. So have kind of the commitment to democracy or to the rule of law in their foundational documents. And then some of them have also adopted enforcement mechanisms for democracy, defense of democracy in particular, here in this table. So you can see that there's a number of regional organizations active in this area. Now, I want to look more specifically at Europe and Latin America, or kind of using, I'm not going to look particularly in very much depth at the mechanisms that the EU and the Organization of American States, as the main and biggest Latin American organization active in this field, have adopted, because that's going into too much detail, I think. I'm just using them as example and as kind of basis for the empirical observations that have then helped me to identify kind of commonalities, similarities, common problems across these different world regions. And what's remarkable is that there are certain similarities and differences in the potentials of the EU and the OAS. The EU has been, as I've briefly mentioned before, quite active in democracy promotion, so supporting democratic transitions or kind of helping to consolidate democracy in countries after democratic transitions by posing this incentive of EU membership or EU association, EU membership negotiations, and then establishing a number of conditionalities that states have to fulfill in order to become a member. And this has arguably supported and fastened, made faster the democratization processes in many Eastern European countries, for instance. So for some time in the 1990s, 2000s, the EU was celebrated as a big success model, and it continues to be. I mean, let's look at the cases of the newly aspiring members now, like Ukraine, for instance, who still see this orientation towards democratic value as something to strive for and to move towards. Yes. And so, yes, the EU has been quite strong in democracy promotion. It has also then, in the course of the preparation of the wave of accessions of Eastern European countries, become more active in the protection of democracy and defense of democracy by establishing certain provisions in the Treaty of the European Union that would enable it to react to any serious breaches of the common norms of the European Union. But these provisions have been quite weak so far, and it has been the EU has been facing difficulties to implement them. In turn, the Organization of American States and a number of other regional organizations in Latin America that followed later on in also adopting the democracy clauses have really focused on the protection and defense of democracy within their member states. They haven't kind of promoted democracy anywhere else beyond their member states. And so this is really has been kind of the focus of these regional organizations. So in the EU case, promotion of democracy has also taken place beyond the EU borders, but also then in more recent times in EU member states, like more the protection of democracy, whereas in the case of the OAS, it has focused on member states. Yeah, but despite these provisions that they also have been facing similar pitfalls of application. And just highlighting a couple of things here, the European Union has been quite strong, as I said, in pre-accession promotion of democracy, but has been less successful in post-accession defense of democracy. That is, the defense of democracy in states that are already members, but then start to undermine democratic norms and rules. And the cases of Hungary and Poland are frequently cited under the governments of Viktor Orban in the case of Hungary, Kaczynski and his successors in the case of Poland, where a number of attacks on the rule of law have taken place. In Poland, this has now been, is in the process of being reversed, which also proves to be very difficult after the change of government recently. But Hungary is now, by many kind of international assessments of democracy, no longer classified as a democracy, or as a kind of very weak democracy only. So a real process of democratic erosion has taken place there, and the EU has really been unable to counter it. It has made a number of attempts to put conditions, to set in place a rule of law mechanism, and kind of monitor and set requirements for both countries, and also more recently the threat of financial sanctions but still it has not been able to really halt this process from the outside. In the case of Latin America, initially, there have been a number of cases where the OAS and also other organizations like the Common Market of the South, Mercosur, and the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, have intervened and have mediated mostly crisis of democracy. But in more recent cases, there have been divisions between the organizations, like different assessments of what was happening in the country, but also within the organizations, like in the OAS, for instance, around the case of the democratic decline in Venezuela over the past 10 years or so. There have been a number of attempts to condemn the country, to impose sanctions, but the Venezuelan government has always been able to rally support and to block any attempt to do anything about the democratic erosion. So why is this such a problem? Despite having these mechanisms in place, why is it so difficult to actually apply them and use them and reverse a process of democratic erosion? You've got a couple of other pictures. So I would argue that there are a number of factors influencing the application of these mechanisms, and one of them is deficiencies of institutional design. So like inbuilt issues within these democratic norms. These can be overcome, I think, as long as the states in the region are still on the same page and do endorse democracy and do still want to defend democratic norms. But as soon as this is no longer the case, and here the second factor comes in, these deficiencies of institutional design and the politicization of decision-making reinforce each other in some sort of vicious circle, if you want. And that is what has taken place, I think, in both regions, kind of contestations around norms, contestations of what democracy is all about. There was no longer a consensus of what democracy is and what constitutes a violation of democracy. And another trend has been power contestations in both regions. So deficiency of institutional design, what does that mean concretely? In many, for many norms of international organizations, there is this problem that these norms and the idea to institute a common regulation of whatever it is, protection of democracy, security, a number of other things, they often clash with the principle of non-intervention. So whatever common solutions regional or also international organizations have attempted, there might always be states insisting on their sovereignty and highlighting the principle of non-intervention and thus defending against these imposition of norms from the regional organization. Another problem is that these mechanisms, as they stand currently, both in the EU and Latin America, are political mechanisms. That is, they're not legally binding. The Inter-American Democratic Charter, as the main document in the Organization of American States, is not even part of the treaty of the OAS. So you can see that in that sense, formally, there's also a deficiency in kind of bindingness, if you want. Often there's a lack of clear criteria. There's very vague formulations like a risk of a breach of democratic norms or things like that, which at the time of formulating them has kind of had the positive idea of kind of being open and adaptable to all types of new situations that might emerge. But then also this creates the problem of not having a clear threshold that clearly stipulates, okay, if I don't know, a president does this, then the organization should react. So it's very much subject to interpretation in the very moment that a crisis occurs, whether a certain action from a government or from the opposition constitutes a violation of democratic norms. Also, of course, regional organizations are instruments to some extent of the governments that constitute them, and therefore governments and their representatives have privileged access to activate these mechanisms, which also means that there has been a pro-incumbent bias, if you want. So it has been much more likely to see a reaction from international organizations if a sitting incumbent has been attacked, for instance, in the context of a coup attempt, than in situations where an incumbent himself or herself has violated democratic norms. Because then, of course, states are quite reluctant to point fingers at another incumbent. They might rally allies around them that block any voting process in the international organizations. The mechanisms have also shown in these cases where they have been applied limited effectiveness. On the one hand, there has been quite a low adherence to formal procedures. A lot of kind of ad hoc mechanisms have been used, ad hoc solutions that didn't kind of follow what was written in the actual documents. And then also there have been a number of examples where unintended consequences have occurred, or where, I'm always citing the case of the coup in Honduras, which might not be familiar to people that are not Latin America experts, but still, I mean, a coup took place there to replace an elected president in 2009. And there was a quite swift reaction from the international community, not only the Latin American organizations, but also the United States, the European Union, a number of others. And despite that, and despite the fact that it is quite a weak, poor country in international comparative perspective, it was not possible to reinstate the elected president. And so you can see that even in such a scenario where you would think, yeah, it's easy that international pressure would have an effect, even there it did not work out due to a number of causes that I don't have time to go into now. So that's the deficiencies in institutional design. The second factor, or one of the factors that leads to the politicization of decision making around these clauses is norm contestations. So for a certain time when these norms were created, there was quite a strong democratic consensus. But then more recently, or over time, it became increasingly contested what constitutes a violation of democratic norms. And this, in the case of Latin America, for instance, the cause for this was emerging different ideas of what democracy really is. And this has to do with the left turn, the so-called pink tide in the 2000s, where governments in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador had kind of new ideas and innovative ideas of how democracy could be reformed. But in the process, they also kind of hampered and undermined some other principles of democracy. And they were quite skeptical of what has been called representative democracy, and rather fostered participatory elements of democracy. So it was no longer so clear what democracy really means. And in addition to that, and we had a similar debate, just to add this, in the European Union, where Orban in his initial years of government argued, okay, we need a different type of democracy. He propagated illiberal democracy. That was what he wanted to establish in the country. And again, we have kind of competing visions of what democracy means here. And in recent years, we increasingly once again have actual openly autocratic actors challenging democracy, like in the case of Venezuela, where I think it's clear that it's now an authoritarian regime. In the case of Hungary, it's a bit more contested, but again, it's also a clear process of autocratization. And so, there's a lot of, there's no longer a democratic consensus, which makes it difficult to come up with a collective response from a regional organizations. And this also relates to kind of defining when there is a concrete crisis. It's no longer that clear kind of who is the bad guy and the good guy, if you want to put it as simple as that, whether changes in democracy, like the case of participatory democracy at the expense of some elements of liberal democracy, whether this constitutes democratic innovation or actually constitutes democratic decline. And in some cases, there has also been the question of whether this use of mechanisms to defend democracy actually defends democracy, or whether it's just to defend the stability of a sitting government. Yeah, I know I'm running out of time, but I'm almost finished. Just to mention a couple of examples of the second factor that contributes to politicization, which is power dynamics. So the question of whether, predominant power the predominant power in the region changes, like we could see in Latin America with the decreasing role of the United States, especially after the 1990s in the 2000s, and then at the same time the increase of the role of regional powers like Brazil, also like Venezuela, who came with their kind of own regional projects, with their own ideas of what the region should look like. And this also had an effect on, or has led to the creation of competing regional organizations and also competing democracy clauses, which at the very beginning in the early 2000s still were kind of in line with the established ones, but then increasingly were used to contest the established democratic norms as propagated by the Organization of American States in the case of Latin America. So this creation of new overlapping regional organizations, hand in hand with this power dynamics and the rise of new regional projects, has constituted a problem. And in the European Union case, there have also been contestations, different alliances. Think of the Visegrad group, for instance, contesting kind of predominance of the German-French tandem in the European Union. At the same time, there's also kind of partisan affiliation within regional organizations, within kind of the decision-making proceedings. I mentioned the case of Venezuela being supported by states with which they had good relations. The same was the case in Hungary, which for a long time was the governing party, was part of the European People's Party group in the European Parliament, and thus protected for a long time from any questioning on the side of this has now ended, but it has been going on for quite a long time. So this sort of power affiliations, power alliances can also play a role and block the application of these democracy clauses. So to sum up, despite their differences and different motivations of why these democratic norms were created, there are a number of similarities when it comes to the application of these mechanisms to protect democracy that are relevant for both Europe and Latin America. And in the final slide, I'm just kind of again illustrating these two factors and showing how they mutually reinforce each other. So once a process of politicization due to norm contestations and power contestations has set in, this process can exploit the existing institutional deficiencies, and the other way around, institutional deficiencies also facilitate some of these dynamics of politicization.